Hey Riley besties, welcome back to the Writing with Anna New podcast, where we talk about all things writing. In today's episode, I'm going to be giving you guys some poetry tips, my top 10 poetry tips that I use always, and I am so glad that you clicked on this video because, as you guys probably know, I love poetry and I only have a few videos on my channel about poetry, so I'm so excited to get into this podcast episode and just chat about poetry, some tips that are really helpful, and I'm just really glad that you're pursuing writing better poetry and practicing your prose. So yeah, but before we get on to this episode, I do want to give a quick shout out to Ecosusi, who has kindly gifted me this beautiful Ecosusi black messenger bag. It literally looks so gorgeous. I'm not sure if you guys can see on the screen, but literally looks beautiful. Ecosusi provides eco-friendly vintage bags for very affordable prices. Ecosusi's bags are literally so aesthetic, but I found they're extremely practical and versatile. These bags are somehow like really sturdy and convenient, and they can hold so much while also being so dainty and aesthetic. If you go online to Ecosusi's shop, you can see that they have amazing messenger bags, adorable backpacks, briefcases, and of course, adorable little handbags. There is free shipping to the US if you purchase one online today, and check out the link below to purchase your Ecosusi backpack today, and you can use my code Anastasia5 for a % off. But thank you so much, Ecosusi, for sending me this beautiful bag, and let's go ahead and get on to the episode. So thank you so much for listening to that, but let's go ahead and get on to the amazing poetry tips that I have for you guys today. So let's go straight into it. The first tip that I have is to write off the top of your head. I'm not sure if you guys know, but I am a huge pantser. I love pantsing. I think it's an amazing way to show intuition and show your core sort of feelings about just like, how you are in that sort of time, because it really does help you kind of, get through stuff and actually see how you're feeling without all this filter, without all this planning. So I really encourage you guys to write from the top of your heads and not to be like too stressed out about the meaning of the poem, the core of the poem, if it even makes sense. I kind of basically treat poetry as a journal. So in this sense, don't feel pressured to kind of say, oh, it needs to be about this, or I really want to pinpoint this. Just kind of write and see where that takes you. And that's literally how I approach writing poetry. I simply sit down, I have a couple of words bouncing around my head, and I just let the page flow. And I think confidence comes here a lot, and just sort of like the surety that you will, go to the next line. So I think sometimes it's really overwhelming when you start a poem to be like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going to happen, but literally write one line and the line will come. And I think if you practice and practice and practice writing I can't say it. Oh my gosh. I know what the word is. Intuitively. Yeah, there we go. So I really encourage you guys to write from the top of your head, because I really do believe this is the best sort of way to write poetry. The second thing to do is to simplify your feelings, simplify your words. Don't feel like you need to make all this fancy stuff, all these fancy words, these fancy similes, metaphors. Just write how it is. And you don't need to have a profound poem that is like, crazy like Emily Dickinson. Like, relax. It doesn't have to be like a huge poem. It can maybe even just be a form of smash poetry where you just, these two, worded lines, bam, bam, bam. I feel like that's really powerful, especially if it's a context of an angry poem. I feel like angry poems are so fun to write. So just write like about a simple thing. It doesn't have to be a feeling even. It can just be simply like going out to see a loved one. For example, I have this poem that says, I'm coming for you in the winter. Jesus has blessed that much. There's a compass in my dorm room and the wind is finally letting up. That's sort of like, it's nothing crazy. It's not like I'm going, in deep. I'm just literally describing coming home to a loved one, through kind of showing the reader that, coming to you in the winter, it's wintertime, there's a compass in my dorm room, the wind is finally letting up so I can come home. That sort of like stuff. It doesn't need to be like, I'm in love with this man who doesn't know I exist. You know what I mean? It can just be simply an action, a sort of feeling about coming home. And I guess with this, don't write too sad poetry. I have a big habit of writing sad poetry, as I'm sure you probably do. So try to write more versatile and more simple things. So again, in this way, don't get too caught up with the feeling. Simplify it and maybe even just do an action, maybe just do something that happened in your day. It doesn't have to be a profound, inbuilt, like building passion or anger. It can just be simply something like that. The third thing is to use action in your poem. So this is kind of really tied into the previous point, which is really ensuring that your lines, you're not too like monologue-y in your poems. Try to be as inclusive of action as possible, because I feel like action is a way that feelings can be truly like described, and it's also just a really good breakup. For example, it can be just a simple, line of rolling up those long striped sleeves, like that sort of action of rolling up those sleeves. It has lots of implications. Like, why are they rolling up their sleeves? It's striped sleeves, it's long. It's like a lot of different things go into this one action. Does that make sense? Like, you don't have to describe it so outwardly. You can simply just write something, and sometimes it doesn't need to mean anything. You can just say, like, you know, I'm brushing my teeth. Like, it doesn't have to be crazy. Just make sure you use action and not just like, I love you, I think about you, you're like a flower. You know what I mean? I hope you know what I mean. The fourth tip is to start writing poetry based on two random words. This is kind of what I do, where I literally just kind of like write a poem based off these random two words. For example, I just wrote the title. I like write the title at the top of my page. Of course, I handwrite all my poetry, but I just wrote the title Baby Teeth, and I wanted to write a poem about that. It's a good way to kind of get into the poetry process, and just to kind of get into the flow of having this. It's not really a topic yet, but it's sort of a start. Baby teeth. That's your first line. So in this way, just kind of grab random thoughts from your mind and just start a poem like this. This is literally how I start my poems. So yeah. The fifth tip is to use color, taste, weather, objects, and food in your poems. So, of course, I talked about action, but I think it's also really important to gather in these different sorts of, like planes of feeling and planes of sort of, description in a way, because you're kind of talking about different things, and they're all different sort of textures and different sorts of, they might hold different memories, hold different sorts of thoughts, reflections, meanings to different people. For example, like I literally wrote a poem a couple weeks ago that was literally like all these different like things. It was like pillows, feathers, gravy, cinnamon, and spoons. I used all of those different sorts of nouns in a poem. It was crazy, and I literally love that poem so much because it's so bizarre and weird and wacky, and I think this really allows you to dive deeper into stylization and seeing how your poetry can flow from different sorts of random words. And yeah, I feel like it's just really fun as well and sort of funky, so take what you will. The sixth tip is to use near rhymes and repetition. I love using these two sorts of stylistic poetry devices. Near rhymes, I adore. I usually go to rhymezone.com and I always look at the near rhymes. I really hate directly rhyming. For example, I hate like the rhyming word bread and said. I like the rhyming word instead, bread, and maybe like bread and bend. They're kind of very similar, bread and bend. They can be used sort of as a near rhyme, but they're not too closely linked that it kind of sounds like a childish almost rhyme. You can definitely just use direct rhymes, but I honestly personally love, seeing how things work with near rhymes that kind of sound very similar but are a bit different, and I adore it so, so much, especially when it's used in songwriting. Oh, beautiful. But use near rhymes, and also, of course, repetition. Like one of my favorite quotes from Phoebe Bridgers' song, it's called The Moon Song, and literally like one of her song lyrics goes like, if I could give you the moon, I would give you the moon. Are you insane? Like, that's great. That's so beautiful. And I think being afraid of, repeating yourself, it's such a good tool. Like, you repeat the main part of your story, especially stuff like that quote I just told you about. in Moonsong. Like, it's beautiful, and I think it really does show and emphasize a lot in your poetry. So don't be afraid to repeat stuff. The eighth tip is to know that it doesn't need to make sense. I kind of alluded to this previously, but know that your poetry does not need to make sense to you or to anybody else. I have a lot of poems that I've literally written and uploaded in on my Instagram, and when I first wrote the poems, I had no idea what they meant. And the way that I write poetry is I write intuitively, as I said before. I can say it now. Woo! I write this way so that I can kind of get the core of what I want. It's sort of like journaling again. Like, you don't know what's coming out of you until you read over it and see what you've actually said. So I write my poems. I don't know what they mean when I first read over them, but as I like kind of go into them and actually like see, what I'm trying to say, I realize, oh, that's what's wrong with me, that I'm annoyed at this guy, or like I'm really stressed about this. Like, it's such a fun experience. And sometimes it doesn't even make sense. And I think a lot of my objective poems, more like feelings that aren't mine that I write, are more like doesn't really make sense. So that's fine with me. For example, I have this little line that I want to share that says, "I'm frightened, I love myself more than myself. Two parts of me are at war." Like, does that make sense? Like, I'm frightened, I love myself more than myself. It makes sense, but you can't describe it. That's what I mean. And that's why I adore poetry in all of its glory, because you're reading poetry and there's a feeling there that you can't describe. That's why it's written, so you can feel that poem, and it doesn't need to describe itself. So know that your poems don't need to make sense, and it's totally fine. I think it's even more beautiful if it doesn't make quite sense to you. The ninth tip is to actually title your poems. It's okay to be incomplete in your poetry, and have like rustic intuition almost within your lines and your poems, or if it's a bit cutty, know that that's part of the charm of your writing. I love Franz Kafka. I've talked about him in my like recent vlog, I think, on my YouTube channel, and I just love his incompleteness with his writings and how that's part of his writing, style. It's part of his charm, and I think titling your poems is a way to kind of say this is the poem in its incompleteness, but hilarity in a way. Like, it's kind of saying that this is the poem, and it can come to change in the future if I want to edit it, but it will stay mostly the same in its, flaws. And I love that stuff so much. Like, I always title my poems, and it's also a good way to kind of move on from a poem if you've been like in that sort of headspace for a long time. And it also just helps with organizational and kind of like clarity of mind. So make sure you title your poems and don't just keep them untitled, if that makes sense. Number 10, this is the final poetry tip I have for you guys today, and that is to listen to music, listen to the world, listen to people, your friends, people you hear on the street, listen to, audiobooks, read books, consume media, read movies. Read movies? You can't read movies. I think I already said that. Watch movies. There's so many different movies that I love. Like, for example, The Sword and the Stone, which is like a really old Disney movie. I love that. Oh, I love it. Like, I literally like tear up thinking about that movie. And there's so many themes that I've written about from that movie, especially from the perspective of Arthur, because he says this really wholesome thing that makes you cry all the time. But he says in the movie, all because you can't understand something doesn't mean it's wrong. And like, wow, that just makes me so emotional. So yeah, know that poetry is meant to be interpretive. It's meant to be inspired by things, and there's no such thing as an original, poem, because there's no such thing as an original feeling. Everyone feels a human experience, so know that you can take inspiration from literally everywhere, especially your favorite types of media. So yeah, I hope that kind of helped you guys, and they're my 10 tips for writing poetry and writing better poetry. I hope you guys enjoyed. These are just some things that I do, and I literally love writing poetry. I actually had a live writing session on my YouTube channel just this morning, and I wrote like 2 poems. They didn't make sense, but it was just so fun to just write poems, and being with people who are just writers is just so fun, and having that sort of comfort is amazing. So again, thank you so much for watching this episode. Definitely check out Ecosusi down below. I love them. They are beautiful and I seriously love their vintage aesthetic. Oh, so beautiful. So definitely go check that out. And yeah, click the link in the description. But I love you guys so, so much. I hope you guys write a lot of poetry. It's a perfect time of year to write poetry. We're all stressed and depressed. So yeah, yeah, I love you. Thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in my next writing video. Bye everyone!